So tell me a bit about your origin story in a way. How did you get into reading science fiction? Was it something that you read growing up, or were you introduced to it by someone?
Um, it's very hard to pin down an exact moment, but I mean, I remember being given remember the original Ralph Bakshi Lord of the Rings animated movie,
Yes.
which divides opinion. Some people think it's great, many people think it's awful. It's an interesting piece of cinema,
Hmm.
but there was a photo book, the sort of equivalent of a novelization of the first two books of the Lord of the Rings, and it was made up of stills from the Ralph Bakshi animated movie, compiled into a sort of narrative book,
Mm.
like a comic book, a graphic novel or something. And I read that long before I ever read Lord of the Rings or anything. It might have been one of the first examples of fantasy or science fiction, as you know, in written form that I was given,
Mm.
beyond what I see on telly, with Star Trek and all of that stuff.
Yeah.
So that might well have been my gateway drug. But I mean, as time went on, I discovered actual real novels, and yeah, I did eventually read Lord of the Rings, and but the first, I think, proper fantasy novel I read was the Book of Three by Lloyd Alexander,
Right.
which today would be classed as YA fantasy. And yeah, as a gateway drug to the whole thing, that I can't really recommend a better place to start. Really, it was yeah, it's a wonderful book if you've never read it. That whole series, the Prydain Chronicles, is the
Right.
whole series. If you've never read it, I heartily recommend it, especially for younger people.
Yeah, I think my gateway originally was probably The Hobbit originally, but then I read a lot of the David Eddings ones, which I think today would also be classified as YA because they seem, or maybe even middle grade, they seem a bit simplistic if
Yeah,
I look at them with an older head. But I think at the time that was all I knew. That was what fantasy was, and that was my kind of gateway.
yeah, I read those a bit late. I was in my late teens, I think, when I read the Belgariad, and yeah,
Mm.
it's I suppose it's very accessible prose wise. It doesn't they don't go in for a lot of complex language in those books, and it's very a very easy read. Also, today I think seems quite tropey,
Mm.
uh, because a lot of the tropes we employ today began with things like that series. The farm boy who's secretly the chosen one and all of that. I think that came from that series. In fact, it might probably existed before, but yeah, that was the one that really popularized it. Yeah.
Definitely. Yeah. So when did your love of fantasy and genre turn from reading it to thinking, I want to have a go at writing it myself?
Probably right away.
Really? Wow. Okay.
I, yeah, I always had a creative urge. I always drew from an early age, but also always wrote from an early age.
Mm.
Uh, and it's a thing you do when you're a kid. You start things and never finish them. So must have started hundreds of stories of what I thought were going to be very long novels, and in writing in exercise books that I got from school,
Mm.
and just getting about 20 pages in and getting bored and doing something else. But yeah, I'd always had the urge to create, and I think the urge to write came along with that. So from a fairly young age, but the wanting to be a writer came when I found out people actually did it for a living. Everything you see on telly, every book you read, people do that as a job.
Mm.
They write things that you consume. And yeah, I've always, wanted to do that. I had the usual boyhood, digressions into wanting to be a paratrooper or an astronaut. But in the end, I always really wanted to be a writer.
Mm. But so when did you start doing it seriously? When did you finish your first novel?
I was 22, I think. I finished my first novel.
Right.
I'm happy to say no longer exists because it's absolutely terrible. It wasn't even fantasy; it was a crime novel.
Oh, right. Okay.
Sort of gangster epic set in London, I'd only moved to London a couple of years before. I didn't even know London that well. I decided to write a modern day gangster epic set in London. Yeah, and it was probably page-wise, it would have been about 300 pages long now. But yeah, I'm embarrassed about it, even though it doesn't exist anymore, because I actually sent it out to agents and publishers. And quite rightly, they all sent it back. This is in the days when you actually send things in the mail, printed on paper.
Stamped addressed envelope and return postage. I remember
Yeah.
those days. I did that early days, yeah, with novels.
Yeah, and you'd look at, I looked up things, how to stop people stealing my brilliant manuscript. I have to copyright it so they don't steal it. I learned later, of course, you don't have to worry about people stealing it. You have to worry about getting anyone to read it. So yeah, luckily it is gone. Yeah, but I don't know why my first novel was a crime novel, because I actually did, even those days, I probably did want to write fantasy. Just I've become fixated on writing this thing. But years passed, and I moved on to writing, trying to get published in Interzone.
Right.
Interzone, people who don't know, is the main British fantasy and science fiction magazine. And I sent them, several stories and didn't get anywhere. Well, it's not quite true. I got some nice rejection letters from them, which were kind of encouraging, because they clearly thought I could write. I just wasn't writing very well at the time. It is what it is. It's a long apprenticeship to be a writer. It takes years. For most people, unless you're, one of these savants who can do it from an early age. But to get to a point where you can write readable prose and formulate an idea into an actual story with characters that make sense and people care about, it takes a long time to get to that point. And it took me a long time. It wasn't.
Me too. Yeah.
Yeah, it was probably mid to late 30s when I actually got there and started producing what I would consider publishable prose, which is, when I, started and eventually finished Bloodsong, which is my first novel, first proper novel.
So over the years of, trying to get published and writing, you must have had a lot of read or come across a lot of good advice and bad. So what was the best piece of advice you probably received in that period, you think, as given to you as a writer?
Well, I didn't really get advice from people in person. I had to read it from, various books I read about being a writer and interviews with writers. And the one thing that kept coming up was persistence.
Right.
Don't give up, basically. The best advice I ever read and can give anyone else is don't give up. Because everyone you ever heard of who is a writer chose at some point not to give up. Because the temptation was there. I don't know if you've had it, but you get a lot of rejection. You have to deal with a lot of rejection. You slave away at things for years sometimes, and then they don't go anywhere. And it's a hard thing to deal with. And the temptation to give up will be there, but if you choose not to and you keep going, and you can write, eventually you get some.
Yeah, I definitely had that desire sometimes just to quit, because I like you, it took me many books and many years, and I started writing in my early 20s as well, and thankfully those books don't exist either, because they went out in the paper and they got destroyed, and it took me till I was in my late 30s before I got somewhere and got published. So yeah, persistence is definitely key. Many books and many times you just want to give up. But so this was an interesting question Nicholas sent in, someone from the Discord forum, said, have you ever come across any good advice that didn't work for you? Because sometimes people say one thing, and I think it's not the only way to do it. It doesn't always work for me.
Because I think everybody's read this book, On Writing by Stephen King.
Yeah.
Now, if you read that book, you learn how he writes, and he writes 2,000 words a day without fail. Gets up, sits down, writes 2,000 words, does that every single day. So I got fixated on the notion that Stephen King, he's the best writer in the world. If he does that, then so must I. And actually managed to do it for a while and sort of convinced myself that's what I had to do. But it's not. It's hard, you know. It's a hard thing to do. Stephen King can do it. I know people write more than 2,000 words a day, and plenty of people write 5,000 words a day. I've found over the years that embracing my comfort zone is actually a good thing, because when it's sort of settled down to a range of about 1,000 to 1,200 words a day, which is my comfort zone. When I sort of embraced it, I actually wrote more over a period, because going at it 2,000 words a day, eventually you'd have to stop. I found I was getting, not fully burnt out, but just getting tired a lot more. I find writing not physically taxing, even though it's a bit hard on your hands. It can be, but because I type when I write, I don't write longhand.
Yeah.
I sort of type as fast as I think, so I type everything. And yeah, I was trying to keep to this 2,000 word a day schedule was doing me in a bit. But when I settled down to just settling into about 1,000 words, 1,200 words a day, productivity actually went up. It was more consistent. I wasn't running up against deadlines or anything. So yeah, I think that it is tempting when you read a book like on writing and you read about how writers you admire work. It's tempting to try and emulate them. I'd actually encourage people to give it a try. You don't feel like you have to stick to it. You don't have to write in one particular way just because somebody you admire does it. Eventually you have to work out what works for you, you know. So yeah, that's probably the best worst advice I tried to do.
Yeah, I think one of the things from the book he said was something like, don't use a $5 word when a 25-cent word would do. And that's something I probably do stick to, because I think, if no one knows what that word means, they have to go and pick it up in a thesaurus. I've probably lost them. So it's one thing I'd stick to. But talk a little bit about editing. What's your approach to the editing process? Do you work all the way through and finish a first draft, and then do you just work through it methodically, or do you have different techniques? Like I will do a dialogue pass, and then I'll do like a world building pass in sections like that when I'm working on a book. Do you have a particular method you use for editing?
Well, my method is when I sit down to work in the morning. Something I've actually started doing more recently is not doing anything else before I write. Don't look at your emails, don't answer messages, don't do any admin. Just first thing you do when you sit down at the computer, I make a cup of tea, I sit down, open Scrivener, and then I write. And I'm finding that's quite useful for maintaining momentum and consistency, because it gets the first chunk of words of the day out of the way, and playing catch-ups out the rest of the day. So that's when I do that, I write. But when I sit down, I actually go through what I wrote the day before, and I do a basic editing pass over that. So I've edited 1,000 words before I write the next 1,000 words, and I do that throughout the entirety of the first draft. So what I end up with is a first draft that's as complete as I can make it. I don't leave gaps. I don't put brackets and say, put in a battle here. Or,
Yes.
I know people do that. If it works for you, stick to it. Great. But it's not like
I can't do it.
I need to make it as complete as it can be. But it's still, even though I do that, it's not finished when I finish the first draft. It always needs to work. So, and I will try and leave it alone for a couple of weeks if I can. If it's closer to a deadline, I don't have the luxury of doing that. But I do, if possible, I'll try and leave it alone, and then come back to it. And then I'll just go through the whole thing from start to finish. And I don't pick out certain sections. I don't try and concentrate on certain elements because the first draft is, maybe 80% there. No, it's not 90 or 100% there, but it's about 80% there. So there'll be work to do, but I find the editing process for me is mainly about making sure the plot is consistent and tying up loose ends, getting rid of the worst written sentences, because there's always a few howlers in there. There's some 40-word long sentences with too many comma splices and stuff. So yeah, that's the basic editing pass. And frankly, at that point, unless I feel like it needs one more go through, at that point I send it to my editor, and it's off into the publishing, the cogs and wheels of the publishing process.
An interesting question from someone about media, the fact that the way we consume media now has changed with streaming and everything shorter and attention span. And do you ever think about any of that, or do you just ignore all of that and write the stories that you want to write? Or are you conscious of changing tastes of the audience and the way they some people write big books and they love it, and then people just want short, punchy books?
I like to think I write what I want.
Yeah.
It tends to be, what I want to write tends to be quite long fantasy novels. That being said, I've got a apocalyptic thriller coming out later in the year under what they call an open pseudonym, which is 63,000 words. So
oh, wow, that's short.
It's short for me. Yeah, I mean, you go back to the 50s and 60s, that's an average novel. An average novel was about 65,000 words. Because they didn't want long novels because it cost money to print them in that state. But back in the age of the pulps, that's a respectable length for a novel. I don't think there's anything wrong with short novels. I quite like reading them. It's just I tend to be more drawn to writing longer books. As time goes on, and the more and more ideas I get, because I have this what I call the unstoppable idea factory in my head. That never seems to switch off. I just get ideas all the time, and some of them are for long books and some of them for shorter books. And going forward, I hope to be writing shorter, not in the main, I'll still be writing long fantasy novels.
Yeah.
But I'll also hope to be writing shorter works as well.
Okay. So the Pariah and the Pariah, I should say, was recently a book club choice, a part of the Discord that I'm a part of. And Monica asked, was there any particular inspiration behind the Pariah and also for the series as a whole? Because I think one of the most difficult questions I get asked is, where do you get your ideas? Because the answer is everywhere. But usually I can trace the seeds for particular stories. So was there anything particular that sparked the Pariah and indeed all of Alwyn's story?
Yeah, I can. I like with you, my ideas come from all over, and trying to pinpoint the exact genesis of an idea is probably impossible. But I remember being interested in the Joan of Arc story,
right?
And I'd always been interested in Robin Hood from an early age, even though Robin Hood is most likely a fictional character. There may have been some real world people who inspired him. But Robin Hood was a fantasy character before they invented modern fantasy. The idea of taking in outlaw and the sort of Joan of Arc-esque figure and putting them together in the same story was kind of appealing. And it basically is what I probably wasn't fully conscious of it at the time when I was writing the Pariah, but that's kind of what it ended up being. When I played around with it a lot, they are not straightforward, he's Robin Hood, she's Joan of Arc.
No.
Not that recognizable as either of those figures. But in terms of the point of inspiration, that was where it came from. And I also wanted a more authentically medieval fantasy world to set stories in. The world of Bloodsong, which a lot of people think is a medieval world, is not. Actually, it's a late medieval, early Renaissance world. Because they've made some kind of scientific and artistic process. But with the Pariah, I wanted something that was, unashamedly medieval, if you like, with, not all of the elements, but a lot of the elements of what we think it was like to live in the medieval world, and all of that entailed. I think that was the main points of inspiration.
Yeah. Now that you say it, I can see the echoes, but it hadn't occurred to me until you described it now. But one of the things I quite like, I found really interesting about this series compared to your others, is Alwyn's voice, because obviously he's an old man telling the story of his life as a younger man. But when we meet him at the beginning, he's very much, he's an outlaw, and his mum worked in a brothel and all sorts of stuff. So he's very common, but he's becomes a scribe, becomes more eloquent, and he becomes more knowledgeable. And the way he's talking about his own life is really interesting. This sort of point of view of an older man looking back on a younger man's life with the foibles and the issues. And was that something you consciously wanted to do when you were building this, to sort of talk about perspectives of that?
Yeah, I think on a certain level, everyone who ever wrote an autobiography or a memoir, whether they like it or not, is an unreliable narrator. Because memory lies to us. I have memories of things, in my life which were caught on video by accident, probably. The way I remember them compared to how they look on video is totally different. It's a totally different memory to what actually happened. Like, I could have gone to court and sworn on the Bible that this is what happened, but I've got evidence. No, it didn't. But that's my memory lying to me, because everybody's memory lies to us. And I think with Alwyn, looking back on his life, there's a certain sense that he's been hard done by history. He doesn't feel like he got the appreciation he deserved on certain levels. But in other ways, he's sort of unflinchingly honest. Sort of one of the few admirable things about him, I think. Even though there are, he's not a completely terrible person, but he does have his moments. But he is, in looking at and being critical of his younger self, he is unflinchingly honest, I think.
I really like his perspective, because it is so cynical in some ways. Like, he'll look at the religious figures that people are all following, and he's always thinking of, oh, I'm going to get out, I'm going to do this, I'm going to, a self-interest, but he keeps getting caught up in things almost against his own will. And I, like you said, I wonder if some of that is part of his own self-deception. Like, he's trying to say he wasn't actually swept up in it, and he didn't actually want to follow, but thinking, well, you may have actually believed it.
If he really wanted to leave, and I think I've made it obvious enough, if he really wanted to leave, he could have done it at any time. He had the skills to do so, but he stayed. Yeah, he didn't have to.
Yeah, it's very interesting to see him talk about these things and just kind of dig under what he's actually saying to try and see that there's more there. Were there any particular challenges for you with writing this, with this series, with this perspective, or just anything in general?
I wanted to make it more not realistic, because you can never really have a realistic fantasy novel. But I wanted to make it more credible and more earthy and sort of mud spattered, if you know what I mean. It's a real lived-in world, not not the world of that Lord of the Rings show they did on Amazon, which just looked like a set the whole time.
Yes.
We'll not get into that, because
we'll be here all day.
But I wanted it to be a lived-in, not necessarily pleasant world, with a recognizable and believable class structure, which was quite rigid, as it was in the medieval world, and that kind of thing. So getting the details right was a bit of a challenge. There's research to be done and so on. And also took a deeper dive into the mechanics of medieval warfare, because it's a bit more complicated than we might think. It wasn't always just they all got together in a field with suits of armor and hacked away at each other. They did do that too, but the actual, movements of troops and organization of troops and all of that was surprisingly sophisticated. There's a lot of logistics, and there's a lot of surviving correspondence from like Henry V's court and so on. It goes on endlessly about getting enough arrows for the archers and buying enough wood to make the arrows and all that. So they were a bit more sophisticated as people than I think we like to think they were.
I like that. I think there's a scene where we have this idea that a man in a suit of armor on a horse is absolutely invulnerable, And yet Alwyn and some of his friends at one point just pull a guy off the horse and stab him because he's like a turtle and he can't really do much except for when he's on a horse.
Well, that would happen, yeah. But the idea that if they fell over in their armor and couldn't get up again is false. You know, people who do recreations of armor today will show you. You can see them on YouTube. They'll deliberately fall over and get up quite quickly. If it was well made, you know, it was quite a flexible thing. But that didn't mean, you know, a bunch of peasants can get together, drag you down and stab you to death. They could, and they definitely did.
Yeah, Christian Cameron's really good at demonstrating weapons and fighting stuff on Twitter and on YouTube. Yeah, so he shows you realistically what happens with a spear goes up against an axe or a shield goes up against a sword and things like that. So yeah, definitely some research there. So the third book in the Covenant Steel comes out this year, and then you said you've got your post-apocalyptic book later in the year.
Yes, that'll be out in October. It's called Red River 7.
Okay.
There's a pre-order on Amazon, but Amazon UK. I don't think it's turned up in the States yet. But I'll be publicizing it in full when it comes out.
Excellent. And are you working on the next thing already? Are you just, you know?
I am. I can't really say what it is yet.
That's fine.
Still in the contract stage, but yeah, I'm certainly enjoying this one, and it's flowing quite well. But it's another series of long fantasy books.
Well, yeah, I guess the shorter projects give you a bit of change of pace, bit of breathing space, and then go on to the next project. Excellent. Well, thank you for joining me. Thanks for coming and answering some questions from the people. And I'm looking forward to reading the second book in the Covenant of Steel and finishing up the third one later this year.
Thanks, Stephen.
Thanks a lot, everyone.
Thanks for asking me.